All right, welcome back. We're going to continue on chapter 10, finish this up on evolution, natural selection. Last time we were chatting about alleles, populations of alleles, migration, gene flow, all those sorts of things. And again, it's a lot of vocabulary. It's all really what it is. And the concepts, though, the bottleneck and all that, should make sense to you. It is pretty straightforward. So let's move on here. So 3 simple conditions are satisfied. Evolution by natural selection is occurring. So natural selection is just a natural process. Now again, in order for this to occur, we have to have the ability for DNA to change. So therefore, mutations have to occur. And there's many ways to look at this, but if it didn't occur, in other words, DNA replication and all those things that we talked about was perfect, then evolution would not occur, and therefore wouldn't be any natural selection, any way to self-adjust as time goes on. And this is sort of fine-tuning. In other words, there's changes that go on, and if it gives some differential reproductive success, in other words, offspring are more fit or more productive than the normal genetics, then it will supersede by natural selection. So the variations must be inheritable, and individuals with one version of the trait must produce more offspring than the ones with different version of the trait. Okay, so variation for a trait. Observing people with their dogs at a dog park, you see all sorts of sizes and shapes and all those sorts of things, and of course you see these new breeds that come out, the poodle, what are they, the modified poodles, whatever they're called now, I forget, but they're real expensive. But it's just modifying various characteristics. Now that would be to the extreme, but anyhow, variation is all around us. We see a lot of things in the world take place that we live in, and we can see that the changes and the variations that we can see around us, and we just know that that's through evolution. The transmission of traits from parents to their children through genetic information or inheritance, and it's a blending. We talked about how the haploid cells will exchange variations through linkage and crossovers, and we get the variation. So we see a blending of the parents effect, and that's why we have some differences there. So the second of the conditions Darwin identified for natural selection to occur, you have to be able to inherit certain traits from their parents. And animal breeders have known this for a long time, way back in Gregor Mendel providing that sort of background in the future. Gregor Mendel predicted certain things, and farmers, of course, could utilize those types of predictions, and we're handing this down to us. So farmers understand plants with the highest productivity generally produce seeds with the highest productivity, and that's important. So condition 3 is differential reproductive success. This was perhaps the hardest one of the 3, but let's see how well we can do with this. There are more organisms born that can survive. Organisms are continually struggling. There's, as we all know, that there's the top of the litter, and then there's ones that probably won't do as well or won't survive, and that is part of the screening process with the offspring. Unfortunately, it seems like a lot of these types of things that Darwin talked about are pretty rough. I mean, you talk about survival of the fittest. Well, there's the unsurvival of the unfittest. There's 2 ways to look at it. So some organisms are more likely than others to survive and reproduce. And that's pretty straightforward, but the name of it could be throwing you off. Differential reproductive success. It just means that they're not all the same. Some of them will reproduce successfully and some of them won't. And it's really the natural selection that Darwin's talking about. And he related that, if you saw in the movie, he was pretty blunt about it. First, more organisms are born that can survive. So, like you saw the runt in that litter there, organisms are continually struggling for existence, so that runt's going to try to make it. Hopefully it will. Lastly, some organisms are more likely than others to survive and reproduce. So the ones that do, and the ones that don't, well, unfortunately, they end up starving or not continuing on. So these three key observations that Darwin made really is the conditions that we know natural selection occurs. And you can reproduce this with various experiments and the like. Evolution by natural selection, a summary. So natural selection causes evolution as individuals with one version of a heritable trait that has greater reproductive success than an individual with a different version of that trait. So you can see the variations represented by colors. You inherit one of the traits, let's say the green, and then the differential success. So if you got purple, not so good. Yellow, well, it's a little bit better, but not so good. But the blue, wow, that one really seems to do the deal. And so sort of through nature, we would be selecting for the blue type. Let me go back to see that here. If I can, there you go. And so that's all about the natural selection part. Some traits make individuals more attractive to the opposite sex. Brightly colored feathers, peacocks, antlers on a male red deer. There's certain characteristics or dances or all sorts of, in the bee world, they see colors that we don't see through infrared and that sort of thing. And that's all part of the reproductive success in the bees and all sorts of other things. So increase in the frequency because they satisfy these conditions for natural selection that Darwin sort of outlined, which is, that's pretty cool. So natural selection eliminates traits that confer poor reproductive success. You know the old adage, well, how fast does this rabbit have to run? Well, it just needs to outrun the green one here. And eventually, I mean, of course, it has to outrun the fox, but if he runs faster than the green one, the fox is going to get that one. And so that's kind of how it is, and that's through natural selection. Although it's pretty crude and rough and tough, that's kind of the way it is. So natural selection is the mechanism of evolution that occurs when you inherit a particular trait, and it's predictable. If you satisfy those three conditions of what Darwin had observed, then you know that is pretty much what's going to happen with natural selection. So it is based on everything we've talked about, the elimination of alleles that reduce the reproductive portion, but carrying those alleles, but the reproductive rate of the individuals who do not. Traits of traits. Do recessive traits gradually become less common in a population? So R.C. Punnett, the originator of the Punnett square, described in Chapter 7, as we've discussed, posed a question to Dr. Hardy, a mathematician whose Punnett played cricket. Hardy replied the next day and published his answer in a science article in 1908. Turns out that Wilhelm Weinberg answered the question independently 6 months earlier, but because he published his finding in an obscure journal, which happens, you know, you get rejected by some other journals. And you see, it's competitive, and sometimes when you have new ideas that are so far out, they could be totally correct, but the reviewers just don't get it. They'll turn out a paper, and unfortunately that happens. But sometimes the obscure journals, because they need to publish, they'll let more edgy type of research get out, and this is what happened. And sometimes it just gets lost. So the result underlies all evolutionary genetics and is referred to as the Hardy-Weinberg law. And it reveals several things, including the answer to the question of whether recessive traits become rare in a population is no. A trait does not decrease in frequency simply because it's recessive. It's all about how that trait is perceived or actually utilized in the environment. And here's the Weinberg. Now, I'm not going to have you memorize equations or to recapitulate it, but if you can follow just in concept here, I think that would be great. So the Hardy-Weinberg law is the frequency of the dominant allele plus the frequency of the recessive allele equals 1. Okay, so a trait does not decrease the frequency just because it's recessive, so they have equal footing is what they're saying in their equation. We can predict how common each genotype will, in the population will be, where the frequency of the homozygous dominant genotypes, and we try to figure that out, the frequency of the homozygous recessive genotypes, and then the frequency of the heterozyte. They all should add up to 1, so whatever those frequencies are. And so the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, if a population is a Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, the allele frequency of the populations are known, predictions can be made about the genotypes of the offspring. So, and this of course came away from the Punnett square and looking at the ratios that it was Gregor Mendel's concept, and this was carried farther with the Hardy-Weinberg. So if you look at the dark brown type of kangaroo versus the spotted kangaroo and the light brown, and then they look at the number of individuals in the population, then the allele frequencies would be the numbers. And if you go back to the equation here, it's p squared plus 2pq plus q squared. So if you take these numbers and 2 times 16 plus 222 divided by 2000 equals a particular, so what they're looking for is the p, and what they're doing is solving for the p part of the equation, and they reduce the equation to the math. So if you follow the math, you can just take my word for it. It comes out to be about 0.1 or about 10% of the population will be that frequency. Q, which is the frequency of homozygous recessive, then the probability of big B, little b, a copy of B, is 222. So if you do the math and figure out the Q part of the equation, which is the frequency of those recessive genotypes, turns out to be 0.8. Now if you notice, if you add these together, it should be 1. And so what they're finding out is that they can solve this equation for the frequencies of each of the recessive genes based on this equation, and that's called the Hardy-Weinberg. So you can find out just by numbers of looking at the phenotypes what the allelic frequencies are for the particular, so little b versus big B. You can use the Hardy-Weinberg and look at the population and the percentage. So this is 87% in that population, and this is 12% of that population. It should add up to 1, and it does, but that just shows you. Now I'm not going to have you work through this problem. It's really not necessary. The idea is, based on the Hardy-Weinberg, you can make the predictions. And so if you look at the equations, and we're not going to worry about how we made them, but if you notice, it's very similar to a Punnett square, but in this case it's resolving each of the conditions. So we know that the PQ is about 10 or 11%, the P squared is about 0.016, and the Q squared is about 0.762. Then you can look at the the overall frequencies of all of these. So these should add up to 1, and they do. But so this particular phenotype is not as frequent allelically in the population, and so if you look at the numbers that would come out. So what they really have done, now you could predict that obviously by looking at the numbers of the individuals in the population, and all they're doing is a systematic way of quantifying that. Now I think enough, that's why I'm not going to have you worry about this. it's sort of implied by the number of individuals in the population. So you could just do the math, add these up and find out what the population is, what percentage, and it'll probably come out really close to that. And so anyhow, I'm not trying to belittle their work, but that's why I'm not going to have you work on that. Just know that the Hardy-Weinberg systematically calculates the percentage of the alleles, and I'm happy with that if you can get that. So no mutations, no migration, no genetic drift. Random mating applies when there is no natural selection. And so this is basically the corollary to the Hardy-Weinberg, is that if you don't have those conditions that satisfy the natural selection, then you can't satisfy it, so there was no natural selection occurring. That's kind of obvious. I mean, it's kind of silly, but anyhow. Knowing the frequency of each allele in a population, we can predict the genotypes. If the phenotype frequencies in a population are not those predicted from the allelic frequencies, the population is not a Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, meaning it's non-random mating or evolution or both is occurring. So if it doesn't fit the normal sorts of traits that the Hardy-Weinberg equation, because all of it has to add up to 1, but if something is not there, obviously it's going to skew it and it won't be true. So one of the 3 assumptions that make up natural selection were violated and something didn't occur. And it could be lots of reasons for that. We're not going to go into it. So here's some more vocabulary. Fitness is the measure of the reproductive output of an individual. So the more they can reproduce, the better that they are for whatever the traits collection that they have. So the individual of the same species with alternative phenotypes. So it's whatever the mixture of a particular phenotype is more successful, then they reproduce more. And that's sort of the survival of the fittest by their definition. Element of importance: an individual's fitness is measured relative to other genotypes or phenotypes in that particular population. So the trait that confers the highest fitness will increase in frequency. In other words, if they're more reproductively successful, then there's going to be more of them. I mean, it's pretty obvious. Fitness depends on the specific environment in which the organism lives, and so therefore fitness varies across habitats, of course. Because if you look at the color difference here, that would make this stick out more to a predator versus you have a white background. The brown rat would stick out more. So the environment makes a big difference in terms of fitness within a habitat. So this is just one example of many where that's the case. Fitness depends on the organism's reproductive success and as compared to other organisms within that population, within that environment. So the phrase survival of the fittest is misleading. It is the individual with the greatest reproductive output that are the most fit in any population in that environment, and which doesn't mean that it will be fit in a different environment, given this sort of scenario where one might stick out more to a predator and be less successful. I mean, if they get killed and they're gone, they're not going to reproduce, so therefore it's not as successful. So fitness is the measure of reproductive output of an individual with a particular phenotype as compared with the reproductive output of individuals with alternative phenotypes of that group in that environment. An individual's fitness can vary depending on the environment in which the individual lives. So that's sort of the corollary to that, is if you change the environment, then the parameters of the fitness, or in other words the rules have changed, and the fitness will tell us at the end of the day which one's more fit. Organisms in a population can become better matched to their environments through natural selection. So the adaptation, the process by which organisms become better matched in an environment. I don't know if you know about porcupines, and it looks like this tiger or lion is going to figure out pretty quick, but they can actually shoot those barbs into their mouth. I've taken them out of dogs' mouths before. It's really hard. It's like fish hooks, and they stick in there and they hurt and they're very painful. And I guarantee you, if if he's obviously not experienced or she isn't experienced it, she won't be doing that again. And it will, unless the animal gets treated, it could be a lethal thing. So if the animals continue to do stupid things like affect a porcupine, then they may be reduced in the population. Adaptation, which refers to both the process by which organisms become better matched to their environment and to the specific traits, make that organism more fit. And it's just logical. It's straightforward. Natural selection does not lead to perfect organisms, of course, because what's the word that is the most important is change. And the weather and various things dictate change all the time. And so in dry years, finches had to eat large, hard seeds, and bigger beaks were selected. But in wet years, the smaller beak made more sense because of the soft seeds, and that's all it was needed. So you could see the variations that would happen due to the differences in the environment. Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, if you've ever remember that, the Red Queen tells Alice that in this place it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. She may have been speaking about the process of evolution by natural selection. After all, if the least fit individuals are continuously weeded out of a population, we might logically conclude eventually all organisms in the population will be perfectly adapted to their environment. But this never happens. And so that's because the things change. Consider one of the clearly documented cases, a beak size in the Galapagos Islands with the finches. Over the course of the multi-decade study that Rosemary Grant and Peter Grant, the family in the paper that I provided, monitored the average size of the finches' beaks, and they found that the average beak size within the population fluctuated according to the food supply, the dry years versus the wet years. And you could see the natural selection occurring or adjusting because of the frequency at which mating occurs in the offspring. This ever-changing average, the beak illustrates adaptation does not simply match forward towards some optimal endpoint. The evolution is that it's going to change, and so sometimes it's better this year, it's worse another year. But this is one way things get fine-tuned to the environment and through this process. Factors that prevent populations from progressing inevitably towards perfection is the environment change. Variations is needed as raw materials are selected, and there may be multiple of different alleles for a trait causing an individual to have the same sort of fitness. In other words, the alleles may offer no difference in a particular environment, where in other environments it may. And so it all depends on what we're talking about. And it's all just common sense. So I'm not worried about you wrapping your brain around this, because really when it comes down to it, it just makes sense. And it's just a systematic way to look at it. Natural selection does not lead to an organism to become perfect. And that's what they're saying. Because environments change, mutations don't produce all the possible alleles at any given time because it's random, and there's not always a single optimum adaptation for a given environment. So some of the alleles variations are meaningless. So they're all just as adapted as the other one in a particular trait. Plant and animal breeders unknowingly understood natural selection long before Darwin did. When humans breed for more and more exaggerated versions of a desired trait, it was called artificial selection. But this was done by natural mating means, and just breeders, and they were just smart about that. So animal breeders and farmers are making use of natural selection when they modify their animals and crops through selective breeding, because the three conditions for natural selection are satisfied. So since the differential reproductive success is determined by humans rather than nature, this type of natural selection is called artificial selection. So we control the environment, we decide what certain traits are, that's called artificial selection. And so certain continuous traits, like a category, white fur versus the orange tiger fur, it could be just a human preference for one or the other and breed for one. or height and things like that is just for desired traits that maybe humans want, and doesn't really give them much in a particular environment. A directional selection, individuals with one extreme from the range of variation in population have higher fitness. So they may change or select the breeding of birds that have the average breast size. In other words, that would sell more. It would be heavier to scales, and you'd pay more at the register, getting that the larger, the more meat. And this is very common. This is what Purdue and all them do. And they actually raised a super chicken that had a lot of breast meat, but the problem was the legs, the weight of the bird couldn't be supported by the legs, and the legs would break. They go down and they get sick, and that wasn't a good idea. They tried to do directional selection in some cases, but in this, turkeys on a poultry farm could no longer mate naturally because the breast muscles have become so large, and then they had to artificially inseminate. So that was the other problem that they had, that they couldn't copulate properly because of the breast being in the way. So individuals with intermediate phenotypes are most fit. So selective pressure babies with low birth weights are more vulnerable to complications. So there's natural selection. And babies with high birth weights are more vulnerable to complications, so selective pressure. So what you have is sort of this more of a population selected for ones that don't have problems in stabilizing selection. Individuals with intermediate phenotypes have the lowest fitness. So a population of individuals relative sizes of these salmon, while the smaller ones may matriculate up the rivers better, the larger ones may have more muscle and do it, but the ones in the middle just can't handle it. Their size is such, the weight for the muscle is just not sufficient, and we get these populations occurring after the selection process. We call that a disruptive selection, and the salmon are interesting choice for that. So, acting on traits for which populations show a large range of phenotypes, we have directional selection, in which the average value for the trait increases or decreases. Stabilizing selection, in which the average value of the trait remains the same while extreme versions are selected against because they're just not productive. And a disruptive selection, in which individuals with extreme phenotypes have the highest fitness. Like the salmon, this is the breast of the chicken example, and the directional is just selecting for a particular trait, which could be a human choice. So by picking taller plants, do humans unconsciously drive the evolution? And the idea is yes, because they're choosing features that have no really relevance in natural means of selection. So yeah, we can affect that. So measured snow lotus plants in the field collections in herbaria, date of collections note, before 1920 average height was 22 centimeters. After 2000 average height was 14 centimeters. The negative correlation between the height and date of collection is statistically significant. Closely related species not harvested by humans did not decline in height across the same period. So human harvesting is reducing the average size of the plants. And they can look at this scientifically, and researchers compare snow lotus size to two different types of sites, heavily harvested versus ones that are not, and you can see this, the heights are definitely different. And it just interrupts the proper selection processes, and it just makes it irrelevant. Humans value the Tibetan snow lotus flower for their medicinal and other purposes. Because people prefer to harvest the largest snow lotus plants, there has been selection for smaller plants. And the data reveals a significant trend of decreasing plant height over the past as artificial selection, because the humans chose that. And there's not any real environmental selection going on. So slow learners, rats making most errors in the maze, are selected and bred with each other. After 6 generations, the rats selected for the fast learning only half as many errors as the slow. So rats making fewer errors in the maze are selected and bred with each other. natural selection can produce and alter the complex trait, including behavior. So slow learners or the fast learners, obviously, if it doesn't give them any real advantage, they may not keep a trait, or if it does, they'll keep that trait. So natural selection can co-opt traits for new functions. Tiny wing nubs, and there was thermoregulatory. They would fan and they would cool down, but over time the wing nubs reached the intermediate size and became aerodynamic, and as a result they could fly, and it would give them some sort of benefit when they didn't. And you can see that, and it's because of the hot environments kind of drove the evolution of a particular wing, which is an interesting idea. Natural selection can change allelic frequencies for genes involved in complex physiological processes and behaviors, like the learning with the rat. Sometimes a trait has been selected for one function, is later modified to serve a completely different function, one that it might not have been anticipated. 5 primary lines of evidence for evolution: the fossil record, the biogeography, comparative anatomy and embryology, molecular biology, laboratory and field studies, and it can pretty much show these sorts of things. The fossil records, Optioptrics shows transitional forms between modern birds. You can see certain similarities and the like. Radiocarbon dating can show the various changes in time, and it's just the half-lives of whatever the predominant species of the isotope is still available, and so we call that radiocarbon dating. So we can measure the radioactivity of various carbon forms. It is an unlikely event when fossilization occurs. It represents organisms that happen to live in a location, biological remains that could be preserved under certain chemical conditions, and only physical structures can leave fossils. So fossilization has sort of certain characteristics in order for us to be able to see them and survive over time, but there are exceptions. So the horse is very interesting, and if you look at the evolution of the horses and certain characteristics. Now, some of these characteristics are not obvious and shown here, but each of the hooves down here, the center of it is sort of like a little pump. So when they're walking, it helps move the blood in the horse, and that trait evolved all the way through. These were more less likely to do that. If you notice the leg size, and they had to change some of their how they slept and that sort of thing, and evolve into the modern horse today. So that particular characteristic of being able to pump the blood, notice the leg size a little bit bigger, but it adds to the overall hardiness of the horse. And but some of these shared some of those particular characteristics, but these are gone now, and the horse is surviving. So it's sort of an evolution, and this is just one trait I was mentioning, but there's a variety of traits that go on. So a missing link, there's certain types of fossils that represents transitional phase between lobe-finned fishes and terrestrial vertebrates. You can see sort of the pseudo hand type of feature, and you can see it develop here, and that is quite interesting, and I can't really explain how that's so. Radiometric dating confirms that the Earth is very old and allows scientists to determine the age of fossils. Now, that's a lot of folks dispute how detailed or accurate the radiometric datings are, but most of the scientists agree. By analyzing fossil remains, paleontologists can reconstruct what organisms looked like a long time ago, and just looking at the fossil records and the like. Looking at geographical patterns and distributions, the biogeography, the study of distributions, patterns of living organisms around the world. And again, you can look at the difference of the beaks in North America and Hawaiian Islands and the like, and based on the food sources. So these ate small spiders, and these ate insects permanently, larvae, where they have to, they burrow in that thing, and you have to have a sort of a different beak, and nectar from a variety of flowers, and so they had to have a much longer beak in order to kind of, I don't know, act like a straw to get in there, to get the food. And of course that's just part of the biogeography, but it's adapting for food supplies in a particular geographical region, and that's all they're saying. Marsupials and their placenta counterparts. So a marsupial is ones that bear their young, resemble placental counterparts, but they bear their young alive, and they use pouches and stuff to mature their infants. And so you look at marsupials and then the placental counterparts. So we have sugar gliders, flying squirrels, numbats versus the anteater, and the Tasmanian wolf versus the gray wolf, and they just had slightly kind of a divergent evolution, and for a particular niche it may be better. So observing geographical patterns and distributions denote similarities and differences amongst the offspring. And we look at homologous structures of embryo stages, the shark, turtle, and the human and the chicken, and you can see that there are some sort of similarities. The human, looking at the human arm and phalanges, and the horse and the bat and the porpoise have similar type structures, but they're for different reasons. And so they're sort of a variation of the theme. Vampire bats consume only a liquid diet, and so they kind of had molars, but because they drink blood, they don't really need them anymore. But they do eat berries and things. The story is not as clean as they're projecting. They can do other food supplies, so it gives them sort of a range of backup for food, other ways to get it. So we have convergent evolution, where things kind of come together to produce analogous type structures, like the wing, and similar structures in that. So similarities in the anatomy and development of different groups of organisms and their physical appearance can reveal common evolutionary origins. And again, it's pretty commonsensical. Molecular biology reveals the common genetic sequences, and you can look at various sequences that have similarities versus uniqueness. And so the longer two species have been evolving separately, the greater the number of genetic differences. So if you look, that there's a lot of similarity between the humans and the rhesus monkey, or the dog and the bird, but the lamprey eel not so much. So there are sequences that are similar, and you can see them there. All living organisms share the same genetic code. The degree of similarity in the DNA of different species can reveal how much closely related they are in the amount of time that's passed. And that's a straightforward observation to make. Evolution of the progress of grass on the golf course. Now, there's definitely artificial going on there, because the laboratory field experiments and antibiotic types of the grasses grow, and there may be, it's not a realistic, because of a putting green or something like that. They have different types of grasses that they want for those, and that's just man wanting that, or humankind. Antibiotic resistance in bacteria, we have seen this over time. This has become really problematic. Bacteria, and we're going to talk about this in the next chapter we're going to cover. Bacteria are lean, mean fighting machines, and their existence really is because they can divide every 20 minutes. Their evolution is pretty fast. We call it microevolution, of course, and they can grow extremely fast. In the 1940s, when penicillin, which is really just bread mold, they noticed that it killed bacteria. Penicillin, over time, though, staph has gotten resistant to it to this day. So staph have figured out a way to become resistant to the effects of penicillin. And that just reduces the ability for doctors to give you something to stop an infection like MRSA, which is methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. And we're finding now that we have organisms that are resistant to every single type of antibiotic that we have right now. So it's a problem. So evolution's always occurring, and we can demonstrate it with the fruit flies or the bacteria, various things. And we know that we can reproduce, and in a controlled laboratory experiment, to show that natural selection and evolution is occurring, but all of which depends on the fact that DNA is in the process of mutation that allows and affords these changes to be made. If it didn't change, none of the slide presentation would have been able to be made. We probably wouldn't be here. So that is the rest of this chapter, and we'll be moving on to the last chapter, which is on the bacteria and the evolution of these microorganisms. And I think that would be most relevant to what's going on today. And so I will be presenting the next chapter this week. Now what I did is I showed the movie, and so I kind of counted that as one lecture period. Then I had section 1 of this set. This is part 2, and that finishes out that chapter, and then we move into the next chapter, which is a really straightforward chapter as well. So I will talk to you later this week on the next chapter area.